You're at your old trusty boat. You call mighty sparrow. I'm in the city of Mardi Gras.
Welcome to the Sailing into Oblivion podcast, where we hear stories from everyday people who do extraordinary things. I'm your host, Jerome Rand. Hey, everybody, just a quick note before we start this podcast. If you want to support and keep this show going, you can head on over to Patreon and become one of the patrons. Just look up Sailing into Oblivion, and I want to do a big thanks to all of those who have already joined and are helping, because it is fantastic. This podcast today is just answering one question, and that is, if you had a month of time to do some hiking on the AT, where would you go and what section would you do? And I want to answer that for my buddy Matt down in South Carolina. And other than that, hopefully we'll get some interviews going. But I'm up in northern Michigan right now, all by myself, doing work on this next book. And so it's a little hard to find people to interview when you're all alone in this in this winter expanse. But I'll be headed back down to the boat soon enough, and we'll get back and rolling. So here we go. Thanks for listening. All right, we are live and coming to you still up here, sequestered in a The Shining-esque situation that I'm in up here in the great state of Michigan, way up at the tip of the mitt, and it is freezing. It is covered in snow, and I'm basically alone in this house, and I'm trying to continue to write this book, and it's actually going pretty well. It's an enjoyable subject, so that absolutely helps because ideas sort of keep popping into my head. But that's where we're doing this podcast, and I got a question from a friend of mine down in South Carolina, and I really wanted to address it with him, but our schedules didn't match up. But I figured I would go ahead and dive into it. And this actually brings us back to the Appalachian Trail adventure a little bit, or at least some of the knowledge that I gained doing the entire thing back in 2012. And the question that I received was, this guy has about a month or so of time that he's allotted to have off, and he'd like to go and do a section of the AT. And so there's typically two types of hikers. A through hiker does the whole trip from end to end, either from Georgia all the way to Maine or vice versa and back. So those are northbounders, which is the most common, and then southbounders, which is, I think they probably only make up maybe 10% of the people that hike the trail. And supposedly the southbound trip is a little bit more difficult because you're starting off in the most rugged terrain that you encounter on the trail, which is up in Maine. But his question, was what section would you do? Where would you go if you had a certain amount of time? And I want to sort of frame this in the perspective of my own experience, because I've thought about that question. I always tell people that I would love to be able to do the entire Appalachian Trail for the first time again. I think doing it a second time would probably not be anywhere near as enjoyable. And I could be wrong. I'm not. I'm the type of person that likes to go and see new things and all that, but I also have a big penchant for nostalgia and returning to some of the highlight areas and seeing some of those sites again, and going into certain situations like little towns or, those certain little camping spots that I pass by that I wish I knew about. And if I had it to do over again, I know I would go there, that sort of thing. And I've thought about that quite a bit because I would love to revisit some of these places, and it's basically where I would go and how much of the trail I would do. And so getting to his question, and it's up to the person. The trail is so nice because it has an unbelievable array of different terrain, different towns, you can be in a situation like in Connecticut, for instance, where you almost only have to carry one night's amount of food the entire time, because there's always little stops and little delis and places you can grab lunch and then grab a little something to cook for dinner. So that's very different than, say, being in the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine, where there's only one little outfitter about midway through, and I don't even know if it's open anymore. Or some of the other areas where you go for much further distances and have to carry a whole lot. And some people might find that more appealing, where you could go into doing something, for instance, like the Smoky Mountains, where you're cutting through that whole thing. You have to bring about 4 or 5 days worth of food with you, and you're going to see very little as far as crossing roads. And I mean, there are a few, but it's more of that natural setting, I guess, is what I'm thinking. So there's a lot. There's a lot of different options, and I think one of the cool aspects of the Appalachian Trail is the idea of doing an entire state, and that sort of, because when you're on the trail, it's a big day when you cross a state line. Those are some of the biggest highlights. And if I were to allot myself a little bit of time, a few weeks or something like that, I think initially that would be my jump off point, is looking at all the different states, how many miles they have in them, what sort of terrain we're going to be looking at, what sort of towns we're going to go through, and trying to figure out if I can do one or if I can do two. And those vary as well. I mean, looking at the numbers, the smallest state, I believe, is, I can't remember exactly how little trail there is in, I think Maryland has like 40 miles. West Virginia, you just like barely touch. Those are some of the really, really small ones. The average mileage, I would say, across the board is going to be in that 60 to 90 mile range per state, with 2 or 3 big exceptions, which would be Virginia, which has 550 miles in it, which is by far the largest or longest trail state. And then Maine coming in at second with about 280. And Pennsylvania is the other big one in the 200s, and that's got about 230, 240 miles in it. So there are those options. I mean, typically, if you're fresh and you're hopping right onto the trail somewhere, you're going to think you probably, and this always is going to go and be just about, each person is going to have it different, but you're thinking of probably hiking between 10 and 15 miles a day in the beginning, and then it doesn't take long before you can crank out quite a few more miles than that. But you can use that as a bit of an average, and always kind of err on the side of caution. I'd say if you're looking to do some long distance hiking and you've done some before, so you know what it's all about, I would say think about maybe 12 miles a day when you're trying to calculate. So let's say I had 2 weeks to go and hike. In those 2 weeks, I'm probably going to spend 2 to maybe 3 nights in a motel in these little towns that you come by. So that brings us down to about 11 days on trail. So 11 days, and let's say we're hiking 10 miles a day. So that's 110 miles. So that easily you could do North Carolina, you could do the Smokies, you could do Tennessee, all these separately. You could do New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. All those, you could wrap the entire state up in that 2-week period of time. And so that sort of gives you an idea of how you could at least pick a state or just go conquer one, because one of the realities about the trail is because it's so excessively long, 2,200 miles, just about, the idea of trying to hit all the highlights, like maybe see some of the Smokies, and then go up and get to McAfee Knob up in Virginia, and then go see the Green Mountains in Vermont and White Mountains in New Hampshire. I mean, you would spend more time traveling to get to those places than you would actually spend in the woods. So I think, as far as in my opinion, it would be much, much more enjoyable, and you'd get a whole lot more out of the experience if you actually pick one little section and you're going to go from point A and stay in those woods and see those trail towns and hike until the very end. Plus, just trying to figure out the logistics of getting on and off the trail. That is something you have to consider, because you don't want to start the trail somewhere that is in completely nowheresville, really far away from the nearest big airport and all that sort of stuff. That's why kind of you have to also look at areas where it would be easy to get on, and then it makes your goal another spot where it's pretty easy to get off and then get back to wherever you came from. So those are some of the things that you have to consider. The other one is how rugged and how difficult you would like the hike to be. So you might be up for a big challenge. You might actually be using it as a way to get back in shape, lose some weight, something like that. Or on the other side of the spectrum, you might want to just have enjoyable hiking, nothing too crazy, just want to go out and spend some time in the woods, not be, blistered feet and sore and miserable in that respect, and waking up in the morning and barely being able to move your legs, which is something that's, bound to happen on the AT, because it is pretty difficult. But there are some areas, Maryland has some of the nicest and easiest hiking I'd ever been on. Pennsylvania, regardless of its reputation as the rocks and all that, there's also areas of Pennsylvania where it's perfectly flat and you're going through a lot of farmland and the hiking is easy. The day I did 40 miles was all through Pennsylvania. So there's so many different options. So I think what I'd like to start out with, just to give you an idea of the breakdown from state to state, is the mileage. So Georgia, the first state, if you're starting down south, you've got about 75 miles, and it's definitely pretty difficult hiking. It's basically the up and downs, up and down, up and down, and it doesn't ever seem to stop. There's not a lot of flat walking. It's either you are going up or you are going down. And so it can be difficult. It for sure breaks a lot of people that go in there sort of imagining a trail much more like Virginia, with gradual hills and more of a, a welcoming sort of trail. When I think of hiking in the woods on a trail, I picture Virginia. Just the nice rolling hills. They're still really big hills and they're still very challenging, but it just seems like everything's a bit more gradual. Georgia was the first 2 days of Georgia weren't too bad, and then you get up and over Blood Mountain, and all of a sudden the game just changes, and it's pretty difficult. It puts you through your paces for sure. So I don't know. Georgia was really cool. I think for me though, and most AT hikers, it would hold a certain place on the podium, so to speak, because it's the first state. That's when you arrive down there with this huge goal in mind to hike the whole trail, and you're super excited. Your energy levels are up. Everything's new. So you remember every little aspect. I mean, when I think about the Appalachian Trail, when I'm still actually working on that book, I just got to figure out a few things before I go forth with that one. But when I was writing that, I mean, I could remember every single thing about Georgia clear as a bell. And then as it went on further and further, especially in the middle sections, that's where I really had to go back to my journals and start sort of dissecting some of the stuff that I said to try and remember exactly what was going on in there. Because by that point, you're almost, I don't think you're like a zombie on the trail, but you definitely are in a zone where you're moving so fast and you're so used to your daily situation that I don't know. Yeah, some of it just blanks. And you, even in the journals, you stop writing with such reverence as you did in the beginning because you're not quite as excited about doing yet another 20-mile day and your feet hurt just like they did the day before and the week before that. So everything does sort of become a bit monotonous in some aspects. But luckily, there's usually little breaks here and there. But Georgia, to try and stay on track here, Georgia, I think, is a very beautiful state. It's going to depend on what time of year you go, and that's the one thing where my expertise is very limited because I've only done the trail once. I started in the beginning of March, so a bit early. And my sort of thinking on that was put up with a bit more cold in the south and deal with less heat and less bugs as I went north. Because I got up to, I reached Mount Katahdin July 13th, I believe. So it was a 133-day trip. And that time frame, if I were to do it again, I'd probably do just about the exact same thing. I don't know why leaving later. I just feel like you'd be more susceptible to bugs and all that sort of stuff. Because I think for me, the most annoying thing and probably one of the scariest thing, honestly, are dealing with, when you just have constant barrage of mosquitoes or black flies, but then you get into Virginia and the threat of Lyme disease from the deer ticks and stuff. That one's pretty spooky. And I remember on my trail, the worst ticks that we encountered were in Pennsylvania, and they were all wood ticks, which are a larger sort of species, and I'm not sure if they can carry Lyme disease or not. From what I understand, it's only the deer ticks, which are so small it's almost like you couldn't see them anyway. But it's kind of a nightmare situation. It changes it. You go from being in the woods and being able to just sit down and have some lunch to having to scope and look over everything and make sure there's no ticks crawling on you. You're constantly doing these tick checks and stuff like that. And it's just not as enjoyable. It's not as sort of fancy free and whimsical, if you will. But so those are some of the things. As far as if you start in the beginning of March in Georgia, you're going to be in sort of winter dead forest. So there's no leaves, there's no buds on the trees, because that is even if for whatever reason some of the trees start budding down, in the valleys, maybe we have a really early spring, you're going to be up in the altitude, and it's all going to be cold. There's no protection from the wind. That's one of the big things I remember in Georgia that early in the season was just the wind seems to be howling and howling day and night, and it's cold, like bitter, bitter cold. So you do have to sort of think about what time of year you have and what your penchant for temperatures are. I mean, as a hiker, I tend to enjoy early spring and fall conditions as far as temperature and all that. If it can be in the 50s and maybe the low 60s, for me, that is the absolute perfect temperature to be hiking in, and nice cold nights, because then you sleep a lot better. You're snuggled up in your sleeping bag and your little tent and everything. And for me, that's great. I would much rather do that than have it be 85 degrees and I'm just a pouring sweat the whole day, and then basically laying on top of your sleeping bag at night because it's still hot. That to me isn't quite as enjoyable. So, but yeah, going on from Georgia's. It's just pretty tough, but it's also pretty rewarding. And there's some pretty cool little towns. You got Hiawassee, You've got some good AT landmarks as well. You got Neal's Gap, which is sort of the first little outfitter, which is kind of nice. That's like 3 days in or so. After you come down from Blood Mountain, boom, you hit this little outfitter, so you can sort of correct some of the mistakes as far as what kind of gear you brought or didn't bring there. So that's kind of convenient. And it, like I said, it's just an AT sort of landmark. But then it just sort of peters right into North Carolina. North Carolina's got about 90 miles inside of there, and North Carolina is very similar to what you find in Georgia. Very, very big up and downs, hard climbing. I think you might even do a few scramble sessions up there, but it's also very beautiful. You've got a lot of great views and just rugged, what I would call atypical Appalachian mountain terrain. Just lots of hills and lots of views and lots of miles. So, 90 miles. If you were to do Georgia and North Carolina, you're going to come out basically at the Smoky Mountains, and you've done 160, 170 miles at that point. So right there is probably a pretty good 2-week trip, maybe even 3 weeks, depending on how much time you want to spend in some of these little towns and stuff. So that's a nice little section, but I'm going to sort of base this off of my friend's off of my friend's request, which he said he had a whole month. So he's got essentially, they call it 4 weeks. So if we're doing our calculations, let's say 10 miles a day, so you could do 400 miles, but you've got a few stops. But I think 10 miles a day is a pretty good average because it includes all the days where you might spend 1 or 2 days in a town, which would be, a 0 day is what it's called, where you don't make any miles at all. So we're just going to sort of go off of that. So you can do 400 miles. He can do 400 miles in one little month and one section. And with the trail being just over 2,000 miles long, so you're looking at just doing about a quarter or a fifth of the trail if you're going to start at one spot and you're going to hike all the way to the other. So you could really do, I would think, you could do what I always referred to as the Deep South section, which would be Georgia, North Carolina, the Smoky Mountains, and Tennessee. And that all is very, very similar, very rugged Appalachian mountain hiking. Again, you're in the South, so depending on the time of year that you go, you can either have it where you're right on the backbone of the winter and coming out of that, and so it's cold, and you get to actually watch as the trees start to bloom and all the whole forest basically comes back to life. With our trail hike, I want to say it was in Virginia when it finally started to really change, and you got to see the leaves coming out down in the valleys and slowly making their way up to the peaks, which was really, really great. So I would think if you were to, say, take off and want to do that Deep South section, so just about 400 miles. Well, let's see, that's actually 14. So it's actually more like 300. So it's a 300-mile hike to get from Georgia all the way up to the border of Virginia. And then Virginia, I mean, you could just peel into that a good little ways. But if you left in the beginning of April, you're essentially going to be, I would think, out of the worst of the cold, although in those mountains, ye be warned, because it can be the springtime and still get snow when you're up at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet. And, even in Tennessee, I believe Clingman's Dome is the highest point, and that's just over 6,600 feet. So it's pretty far up there. And it does, you understand very quickly that just a few thousand feet can be a huge game changer as far as temperature and weather conditions. So So that's a nice one. The Smokies, though, the Smokies are, it's hard to describe because it's a balancing act between absolutely stunning forest, this just old, ancient forest that feels ancient. And there's lots of animals, and it's beautiful, but it's also difficult. It's raining all the time. I mean, the Smoky Mountains get their name because it's always hazy. It's raining, it's this sort of smoky place. And it's difficult because you have to stay in these shelters, and there's typically a lot of people. I believe the Great Smoky Mountains are still the most popular national park in the United States. They receive more visitors than any other, and there's a lot of people that live within a day's drive of that place. So it's definitely very popular. So you have to sort of go back and forth. And that actually also sort of leads into another thing. Because the Appalachian Trail is just an open thing where there's a lot of people these days that go and try it, you do want to consider how much of a social activity you want it to be, because if you're looking to have your own experience and you don't want to be just crowded with other people, you don't really want to be in the culture of the thru hikers and all that sort of stuff, well, then you're probably going to want to go and start and do something up in the north if you're starting in April or May or something, because the vast majority of hikers are, again, coming from Georgia going north, and they're starting from March. I think the majority start in March and in April. So those 2 months, you're going to find the most populated part of the trail is going to be down at the start, and it's going to just thin out and thin out. And I can't remember what the year that I did it in 2012. I can't remember exactly how many people had dropped out, but I think the average by about halfway, so just about the time you're in hitting Pennsylvania and stuff, you're looking at about 50% of the people have already dropped out, and a huge amount have already dropped out in the first 2 weeks. So it's one of those things where if you hop down and start in Georgia in April, you are going to be surrounded. All the shelters are going to have lots of people in them. There's going to be tents everywhere. And that might be part of what you're looking for, is to have that social sort of interaction, because some of the best times are, after a good day's hike and you're around that campfire and people are cooking food and telling stories and all that. I would highly recommend that those situations, you just make sure you have your own tent, because one, it might be hard to find a spot in a shelter, and two, you're probably not going to want to actually stay in a shelter if at all you're a light sleeper, and things like snoring and mice and people constantly shuffling around. The sound of a sleeping bag against a little Thermarest sleeping pad, it's like old rain pants, like voop, voop, voop. So every time you move, it's pretty loud. Now, normally you sleep pretty soundly out there because you're pretty tired after a long day's hike, but it's just one of those things to consider. So the other big one, and it would be definitely a challenge to do this section in a month, but it could be done, mostly because the terrain is a little easier. You're still going to do some big climbs and all that, but Virginia would be kind of an interesting challenge to take on. So you're still south of the Mason-Dixon line, so you're still in the south, but you're not in the deep south anymore, and that's one that I definitely considered, because, again, it's 550 miles. So if you've got 40 days, or if you've got 30 days to do that, you're going to have to do well over an average of 10 miles. I think you're going to have to do more in the range of 15, 16 miles a day as an average. So that doesn't mean you have to do that day one and continue. If you're going to be doing the entire thing of Virginia, you pretty much, start out doing 10, 12 miles a day. After about a week, you're going to be doing 20 milers. I would think pretty easily, as long as everything feels good. One of the most common mistakes that people I saw were making were they were so excited about first getting on that trail that they just hiked way, way longer than they should have, and would end up so sore or, hurting themselves, straining their Achilles, hurting their knees. It's just one of those things that it's born from your own excitement. And I know I had to rein myself in a few times, and luckily I had some slight but annoying knee pain, and that scared me enough to slow me way down in the beginning, which then I believe it was about 5 weeks in, the knee pain disappeared, and then all of a sudden I was like an Iron Man out there, and that was a great feeling. And you would definitely, I think, find that in Virginia. By the time you're wrapping that trail up, you'd probably feel like you could walk to the moon and back. And Virginia's got some really cool towns. There really is some beautiful, beautiful hiking up there. I believe it's got the Roan Mountain range. I've got my little guidebook here, but I don't want to get sort of lost in it without and not make it so that you guys can understand, because I'm looking at it. But you've got like Shenandoah, which is absolutely beautiful. I mean, even in the AT guidebook, the state of Virginia is broken up into, I think, 3 or 4 parts, because it's absolutely massive. But you've got some really, really cool stuff. You cross a lot of highways too, that's for sure. Pearsburg. Oh man, yeah. When I look at all these names, it just makes me want to go back out there so bad. But I think for me, it's going to be the Pacific Crest Trail would be the next one to tick off the list if I were to slice out some time to go and do another long distance hike. See if I could get back in that sort of shape again. But yeah, okay, so that's the one I was looking for, Damascus. Damascus, Virginia is one of the probably the most well-known of the trail towns, because that's where they have trail days, a big like party outfitter week where basically you can go in there, and if you've done the AT or you're curious about the AT, that's a great place to go and find out every last little bit of information you could ever want to know about the AT, and have a great time meeting tons of people that have hiked or are hiking it. Some people actually base their through hike on making sure they can be in Damascus for trail days. Let me see if they actually tell you when the trail days are. Friendliest town on the trail. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I just don't want to sit here and read out of this book, like sort of plagiarize it or whatever. But yeah, it's Virginia's just cool. It's really, I thought it was really interesting, and you hear about the Virginia blues, but if you're only doing it as a section, I don't think that's going to come into play at all. I don't think it got really all that boring, and I had already been on trail for quite a few weeks just to even get there. But it has that reputation for a reason. You get the Virginia blues because people sort of lose sight of the whole thing, and they get bored, and then they quit. They get off the trail. They get depressed. So Virginia, I think, is definitely a worthy section, and for somebody who's up for a challenge, if you have a month, Virginia would be a pretty cool challenge to go and accomplish that. So again, yeah, 550 miles there. The Deep South section, Georgia, all the way to the border of Virginia, you're looking at about 300 miles or so. So those are two definitely pretty cool sections that I think a month would be pretty good for. And that's just sort of goes to show how the terrain changes and will slow a person down or speed a person up, because I would think the Deep South section, to do that fresh on the trail, yeah, you'd probably want about a month. Yeah, the Virginia section would be tough, but you could definitely do that in a month. And then you get into Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is sort of the oddball. I always used to say that if I was going to do the entire trail again, the only state I would completely skip would be Pennsylvania. And my thinking on that really just comes from the boulders and all the rocks. I mean, literally, there's miles of trail where you are just stepping on, little boulders that you can still move if they're unbalanced. There's snakes in there. There were ticks everywhere. There's a lot of areas that are polluted, and you don't really want to drink the water. It was kind of hard for us to find water in that section. It did have some pretty cool towns, and it did have some very pretty views, so it's not all bad. But it's just one of those sections where I just wouldn't want to go through all that again. Because I've already done it once, and I was glad I got to experience it. And it could have just been the year that I did it, but I do remember point blank looking down this trail with 2-foot tall sort of wild grass or whatever coming up, and the trail's only about 6 inches to a foot wide, and I could literally see all the way down this trail little tiny burgundy colored wood ticks hanging on every other blade of grass, just waiting for the next hiker to walk by, and they're just gripping right on you. I mean, it was pretty incredible. You had to keep your eye on that that year more than that's more than I've ever seen. And the wood ticks up in Minnesota, up in the Boundary Waters, get really bad. I've seen them pretty bad there, but Pennsylvania just took the cake. It was crazy. So I don't know. I guess I'm just gonna say I wouldn't recommend Pennsylvania unless you had some notion of wanting to experience sort of the misery of the rocks and all that sort of stuff. Then hey, maybe that is the little section for you. There's 240 miles or so of Pennsylvania in there, and it presents some pretty challenging stuff, but it also presents some pretty wide open, easy hiking the further north you get in there. And, there's some areas where I think it's flat walking pretty much all day. You go through these farm fields, and then you go through these towns and back into the farm fields and then across the highway. And I just remember stopping, I think it was in like a Super 8 motel after 40 miles. And I took my boots off and I fell into that bed, and I just remember leaving the door open so that the pizza delivery guy could just come right in, and I wouldn't actually have to get up and use my feet. It literally felt like I had walked over hot coals. The bottoms of my feet hurt so bad after 40 miles. I was glad I did it, but man, that was painful when I think back to it. So that's sort of the South. And then obviously the other half is you've got New England. And then, I guess I don't know how I would characterize it. I guess I would say the middle north, because I like to think of the AT in 4 sections: the deep South, the South, the North, and then New England. I don't know. It's kind of hard because obviously I think of Connecticut, Massachusetts as New England. I don't know if I actually consider Vermont New England or if it actually is. That's a good question. New Hampshire, Maine, obviously it was coastal, but I don't know if, I guess you'd call it New England. Well, besides the point, New Jersey and New York are tough. Don't let the low numbers of miles fool you. So there's about 70 miles in New Jersey. Oh, we've skipped over Maryland and Virginia, West Virginia and stuff. Sorry about that. If you are looking for like just maybe a couple of days, a weekend hike or something like that, and you want to do an entire state, go and hike Maryland, because it is just absolutely amazing. They've got great views. The shelters are beautiful. They're like log cabins. They all have tent pads and stuff. I don't know how populated it would be. When I went through, I barely saw anybody there, and that would have been Oh man, I can't even remember what time of year that would have been. That would have been probably sometime in late May. And it was unbelievable. You could just tell that in that state, they definitely put a lot of money into maintaining the trails, the shelters, and everything. And it's just wide open walking. That was a state where I did a lot of night hiking, not only because we had one of those super moons, but also it was you sort of just knew that it wasn't such a challenge, the actual terrain, that you could get away with hiking, and in some respects we got away with it without even using our headlamps, which was really cool. When you let your eyes adjust for long enough, you get a really super bright moon that's right overhead, and you can pretty much see the trail even if you're in the woods, which by then the trees had leaves and all that sort of stuff, but it was pretty cool. I definitely liked Maryland, and it's short, it's sweet, and you get your little taste of the AT, and you could do it pretty much in a weekend. So you got about 41 miles. I guess you'd probably want a little more than a weekend, maybe just a long weekend. So that's a little offshoot, I guess, from our initial question with a month, but you get through that, and then you get into New Jersey, the Bear State. Lot of ups and downs there. You got like Delaware Water Gap is the end of Pennsylvania, I believe, and then you cross right over into New Jersey and come to not Cloud Pond, but Sunfish Pond, which is sort of the first glacial pond that you come to on the AT, and it's sort of this cool feeling. So now you're like full on in the north, and for me, once I got into New Jersey, it was really an awareness of we were getting close to the end, even though we're just over halfway, to Mount Katahdin, and still a huge amount of trail to do. It's still, there was just this idea of like, wow, we're well past the halfway point, and holy cow, it hits you like a ton of bricks, and then all of a sudden you want to like slow down. But that's besides the point. So New Jersey, you got a lot of bears. You got some great hiking. It's very difficult. New Jersey and New York. So New Jersey's got about 70 miles. New York's got about 90 miles. One of the nice parts about getting up this far north is you're going to find that you do not have to carry quite as much food, because there's the availability of stopping and resupplying far more than you get down south and in Virginia. So that's something really to sort of consider, because if you've got this little chunk of time, and let's say you want to do New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, you're looking at about 350 to 400 miles, which is definitely doable in a month. It'd be a pretty epic little section to do. But the nice part is, compared to the Deep South, where you're going to be packing sometimes for 4 or 5 nights in the woods, up in New Jersey all the way through Massachusetts, you're pretty much, you might have to do that once or twice, but the vast majority of it, you could probably get away with 1 or 2 days worth of food. And you're also going to be able to eat. You're not going to be just living completely off of noodles and tuna and peanut butter and all that, because most of those towns, you can also stop and they have little delis or restaurants and things like that. So your initial diet doesn't even have to completely require you to be eating sort of this trail food, so to speak, which I like. Trail food. It tastes great. I like Mountain House, I like dehydrated stuff, but I know that it's really not all that great for you. And it's hard to find really good foods, and maybe I just don't know about them and they're out there. But foods that are healthy that you can take out on the trail, and I don't know. I've never really found much outside of some of those powders and things like that, the green powders where you can just mix that in with some water, which I think now Though I didn't know about them back then, I would for sure bring some powdered stuff to be able to do sort of like a green, like life drink or whatever, every single day on the trail, just to give you that boost of nutrients. Because, like it or not, a thing of macaroni and cheese really isn't that nutritious. And it's probably pretty hard on your body to sort of deal with that food, but when you're out there hiking, you're really just looking for all the good calories, and because you are burning thousands and thousands of calories every day. So back to sort of that section. Yeah, I would think to section one off for a month, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts would definitely be a good option to go for, especially if you like seeing a lot of the towns and that sort of thing, because you are going to go through a huge array of little towns and be able to get to pretty cool little spots to check out. Excuse me, and really experience more of a less or you're going to experience less of the just constant woods and more of the Americana, so to speak. I don't know if that's the right word, but you're basically walking from town to town, and you're gonna come into a town every couple of days and all that. So that's definitely a vastly different hike than doing, say, the Deep South or even Virginia. So that's definitely another section, which brings us to the final section. And this is the one that I would probably, I want to say, if I was really looking for a challenge, I would probably take on the three final states. I would probably take on Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine one more time, because this, without a doubt, is going to be the hardest section to hike, but it's also going to be the absolute most beautiful. Now, whether or not that can be done in 1 month, fresh, starting on the trail, I don't know. I mean, you're looking at about 300 miles or so for Vermont and New Hampshire total, and then another 300 just about in Maine. So you're looking at like 600 miles. So comparable to Virginia, maybe a little bit longer. And I don't know. I kind of think if I was going for it and I wanted those grand views from the White Mountains and all the stuff up in Maine, I'd probably, if I were to do it, I would probably start in New Hampshire and just do New Hampshire and Maine. Vermont has some beautiful, beautiful hiking, the Green Mountains, all that sort of stuff. And it's got some great little towns. It's really is a beautiful place, but at the same time, it's really muddy. It's always pretty wet. I can remember sleeping essentially in swamps at high altitude and going through hailstorms in June. So that wasn't it wasn't the best, but it really comes down to the mileage. I mean, trying to squeeze out all those miles, let's call it 600 miles in a month, would be pretty tricky, fresh on the trail. You can do it after you've already hiked the previous 1,600 miles of the AT, then it's not really an issue. But I would think that, I would either spend a month doing Virginia and New Hampshire, or spend a month doing New Hampshire and then Maine. And the New Hampshire Maine one would be definitely a lot more difficult because the mileage is a lot more. But that section is, without a doubt, the most stunning. I mean, I remember more than anything staying up on Mount Moosilauke, which I believe is in New Hampshire, and it's this sort of rugged peak up there. It's one of the first really big peaks that you get up there, and you're above tree line. Out west, I think to get above tree line, you could be, I don't know, 10,000 feet or something like that. I'm not really sure. But in New England, and way up north there, the tree line really is only around like 4,000 feet or something. And I'm not sure why. I'm sure it has something to do with the weather patterns and all that sort of stuff. But so instead of getting to the top of a mountain like down south where the vast majority of them are covered in trees, and unless it's still everything's winter dead, you're not really seeing much besides just the forest. Up there, you get above that tree line, and now you've got the whole world, horizon to horizon, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So that's definitely something to take into account. Now, it is very, very rugged climbing. It's tough. There's a lot of big ups and big downs, and they don't ever want to stop. You've got a lot of bears. You got a lot of moose. Once you get up in Maine, definitely moose are an issue. When you hike on the trail there, you're seeing boot prints in the trail mud, and then you're also seeing hoof prints from the moose. So they are everywhere. We saw plenty of them. They're very beautiful, but they can also be kind of scary, a little dangerous. I don't know when the rut season is. Part of me wants to say it's in the spring, just because of that whole idea of like springtime. But I don't know. I don't know when the rut is. I don't think it's any time around when normal AT hikers are out there, but really, really beautiful sections and just the biggest, most majestic mountains. And you still get a lot of really great trail towns. I think my favorite in Vermont and New Hampshire really was on the border when you go into Hanover, because it's this cool little town. Dartmouth College is there. There's a lot of outfitters. There's a lot of great restaurants. And there's just a lot of nice people. You can go out and just meet people. And by that time, a typical AT hiker has a huge beard, so it's sort of a big red flag. Everybody knows who you are and what you're doing. And as long as you don't smell too bad, they'll probably approach you and want to ask you questions and stuff. But pretty cool trail towns. And then Maine definitely had some really, really neat places. I'd want to say my probably one of my favorite trail towns was Monson, Maine, and it's sort of the last town that you really come to before entering the 100-mile wilderness. And it's barely even a town per se as far as size goes. You know, there's only one little general store, gas station where you resupply. There's a couple of hostels and a bar or two, but that's basically it. But really, really cool. Lots of nice people, and almost everybody that's up there is involved with the trail in some way or another. So it's kind of a cool little spot, and everybody knows they're getting right to the end, or you're running into people that are starting their trail going from the north to the south and being a southbound trail hiker. So you get sort of this mix of people up there, which is pretty cool. I don't know what it would be like to hike that section outside of end of June and beginning of July. For us, it was pretty hot. It wasn't too bad yet, and the bugs weren't all that bad. But if you go further into, I know Mount Katahdin closes its gate sometime in October, so there is a limit as far as your timing, September and everything. Because even in July in Maine, on some of the peaks, you're scrambling through these rocks, and I was still finding snow that was basically locked away underneath these giant boulders and stuff. So I think there's going to be the threat of snow is pretty much year round up there. But if you were up there in earlier spring, say you started out in April and you headed up there, I think you'd probably see some pretty rugged cold conditions. But by August, I know living up in Maine in the summers for the last few, August is hot. I mean, you're looking at 90-degree temperatures, and I know water can become a little bit difficult to find up there. But I don't know. Maine seemed to have a lot of rivers, but it's rugged. I mean, they say by the time you get to Maine, you've done the vast majority of the trail, but you've only done a small percentage of the actual vertical climbing and descending. And Maine is absolutely brutal, but it is quite beautiful. And if you wanted to, say you had a month and you were pretty sure 10 miles a day is about all you wanted to do, because you didn't want to just hike for 10 hours. You wanted to hike and then set up camp and relax and all that. Just the state of Maine, with about 280 miles, would probably be a pretty good section, and you do end up getting that really quintessential AT moment where you get to see the northern terminus, which, again, for the vast majority of people hiking that trail, that is the goal. That's the thing that we're envisioning in our head. That's the driving force that you're trying to get to. And when you get to see it, I think that would probably be the only drawback, is that if you only did the state of Maine, you'd get up there and you'd see it, and it'd be pretty cool to see that sign up on top of Mount Katahdin. But boy, it's if you're going to see that sign one time in your life and you have any interest in doing a long distance hike, do the entire trail, because the sight of that sign will literally bring tears to your eyes. Did to me, and it does to almost everybody. It's ridiculous how big of a change your perception of something can be. And, this is something I have a lot of experience with out sailing, where I've always said that the only way to make perfect conditions even better is to have to go through 2 weeks of hell to get there. And that's something that I've learned along the way in my life, just about, if you really want pure joy, you got to go through some pain to really get there, to make it that much better. And although there always is a balance, it's not like you want to spend your whole life not eating chocolate and then the day before you die dig into a Hershey bar sort of thing. But I digress. So that's another section, and you could split those up in any way you want. But Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, if you had a little more time than a month, you could go for it, or you could cut that down a little bit. So I don't know. Those are my big sections: the Deep South, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and all that. And then sort of the North, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Mass, and then the far north, or quote unquote New England. Those would be the 4 different sections that I would say would be great to choose from. And if you had that month. And again, I mean, if you got 2 weeks, there are definitely areas where you could get through 1 or 2 states in one little shot, which would be pretty cool. But it really just is going to come down to when you want to go, what sort of terrain you want to have, how big of a challenge you want it to be, and I guess just where you feel like doing it. The other thing could be, maybe you live in Ohio and you don't want to travel all the way down south to go and do this. Or maybe you do. Maybe it's April in Ohio and it just snowed again and you want to get out of there. And so you head on down to where it might be just a bit warmer down in Georgia. So there's so many options. That's part of the trail that I really, really like, is that if you do get to return to it, or you're just trying to get a taste of it, you have so many choices as far as where and how and what sort of stuff you want to see. So the AT just provides so many great opportunities to sort of see this storied Appalachian mountain chain and all the towns and everything that's out there. It's really, really cool. I guess on some other notes, thinking about packs and what to bring and all that sort of stuff, I would just consider, if you're out there for a month or just a couple of weeks, you really want to make sure you don't fall into the trap of bringing too much stuff. At the same time, you don't want to get caught too short. I would always have a very, very small tent, or at least a tarp with some sort of mosquito netting around it. A tent's going to be the most protective, so when it's raining, your chance of staying dry is much better. It's going to be bigger, it's going to be heavier, so you have to consider that, but it's going to be a better way to protect yourself at night. I had a tarp for the first half of the trail because I figured it'd be cold enough where the bugs weren't going to be an issue, but I did suffer from, dealing with the rain and all that sort of stuff, getting into the sides and getting me a little wet. But on the AT, you soon find out that wetness is sort of life out there, and the sooner you accept that fact and just start to try and figure out a way to enjoy it, then the better. If you constantly try to sort of buck Mother Nature and try and beat it, you'll find that on this trail and out there, you're done for. You'll just have a miserable time because you're spending more time trying to avoid your situation than actually just immersing yourself in it and sort of living in it. But as far as the gear goes, yeah, I mean, because you always want to make sure you have something for the situation when you get to a shelter and the shelter's full. And so you're going to be sleeping out under the stars. And you want to make sure that if it's just raining constantly, you can sort of protect yourself. So always going to have that. You're going to have a sleeping pad, sleeping bag. Cooking stuff, I had some crazy little tiny stove that though it only weighed like an ounce, I would go with a jet boil. I'm not sponsored or anything by those guys, but the jet boil is super easy. It's super fast, and I don't know. They're light and they're a little clunky as far as their size and stuff, but you've got essentially your whole cooking setup is just in one little thing, and just the fact that it boils water that fast, because the vast majority of what you're eating is just something that you either put in water and boil, or you boil water and then add that. So jet boils work great, super easy, and I would definitely go with something like that. Obviously, you need a headlamp, but you got to keep things bare bones too. I've seen people pull 3 or 4 books out of their packs, and even if you're only out there for a month, you're still carrying that the whole entire time. So I recommend if you really want to be a reader, always, have one book or something like that, but maybe even cut it up into sections. You'll still want to have one of the AT guidebooks. I know the Appalachian Trail Through Hiker's Companion, that one's still in print. I'm not sure if AWOL is still in print, but you'll have a guidebook. Typically, you can get away with that without having to have the maps. I found the maps as more something that was enjoyable to look at and have, at tent time, at night, when just before I go to bed, writing in my journal, and then I'll pull out this map and look at it. But it wasn't by any means. The trail is so well marked and so easy to find your way that having every single map, I mean, you'd have like a pile of like 15 of them, and that creates weight. You can send them ahead to the next little towns and stuff, but I just found that maps were a little extra, but they were just for entertainment purposes. I don't think I ever really came into needing it. And the one time I did need a map or want a map really bad, I found one on the trail, which was the craziest bit of trail magic I've ever seen in my whole life. But in any event, and then some rain gear, that sort of thing. One change of clothes. That's the biggest thing. Is you got to remember, once you're out there, you're going to smell, you're going to be filthy, and that's okay. When you go into a trail town, you'll be able to go and wash that one set of clothes. I did bring one change of boxer shorts and I think 1 or 2 pair of socks. And the reason for that is sometimes when you get completely saturated, one of the things that you really want to do is you want to get into camp and at least be able to put a dry pair of boxer shorts on, because that definitely feels really, really nice, and a dry pair of socks, because your feet, sometimes you pull them off after you've been walking through water all day, and the skin on your feet is just, it's gruesome and it's white and gross and wrinkly and peely, and and all you want to do is dry your feet out. So there's that. And, obviously there's a million other little things we could mention, but I think those are the sort of the big ones. But again, I think one of the things you just want to make sure that your pack is super light as you can possibly get it, which means don't bring all the extra stuff that you think would really be nice to have out in the woods that chances are you're going to find you don't ever use out there. Binoculars, extra books, the fancy leather-bound journal that's, huge. You can always transcribe anything you write into a fancy journal when you get home. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And nowadays, yeah, obviously a cell phone for emergencies. Back when I did the trail, the vast majority of it, there was no cell phone coverage. But now I'm pretty sure that has changed quite drastically. I see a lot of people posting a lot of people were posting stuff on like TikTok and stuff like that. And they were doing that pretty much in real time on the trail, which it's pretty crazy. But having that phone allows you the phone is also your camera and all that. So it's definitely worth having one because it's not like you're going to want to have a phone and then bring some camera and then, all that. So it's all about that weight. Other than that, I don't know. I guess I hope that sort of answered some of that, or at least provided some information for anybody that might want to tackle just a little section of the Appalachian Trail. And, one of the things that you might find in the end is that you do one section and you can't stop thinking about it. And then the next year you do another section and another section. People often do that, and they'll take 10 years of their life, and eventually they will have through hiked the AT, but they've done it in sections, and that's quite an accomplishment as well. I think in some respects that might be harder because you have to be diligent with it year after year after year, and even though you may have started it when you're 40, you're finishing in your 50s, and that's a lot of change to go through and still continue to whip out a few 100 miles every year. So pretty cool stuff. Other than that, I know it's sort of a divergence from our normal podcast, but you know what? I'm finding this podcast is just it's gonna be sort of free flowing. I've got a pretty cool interview coming up here in the next couple of days with one of my oldest friends, Colin. He is the son of Buzz from the book Sailing into Oblivion. He's the one I was honored to spread his ashes all around the planet. So that should be pretty cool. We'll talk about some snowboarding and also some mountain climbing, which is what he and his father used to do. So that should be pretty fun. Other than that, thanks for listening, and until next time.